The breeze startled me. I was standing on the porch, barefoot, a cup of coffee cooling between my hands. The Carolina sun had just begun to push through a thin veil of clouds when a sudden wind swept across the yard, brushing past me like a whisper I couldn't quite hear. The chime above the window swayed softly, its sound faint but steady, the kind that makes you pause without knowing why. And that's when Mark appeared at the steps. My son-in-law, my daughter's husband. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavier than the wind that had stirred it. His eyes met mine, sharp at first, then uncertain. There was no greeting, no polite smile, only silence, and sometimes silence says more than anything you could ever confess out loud. "Morning, Lorraine?" he said finally, though his voice betrayed something else. Hesitation, maybe guilt, maybe confusion. I tightened the sweater around my shoulders, grounding myself. "You're early," I replied, though I didn't know why he was there at all. He gave a small shrug, a poor attempt at casualness. "Julia said you needed someone to check the gutters." We both knew that wasn't true. The words landed flat, hollow, but I didn't correct him. I just nodded and stepped aside. He walked past me, careful but close enough for me to feel the weight of his unease. Inside, the air felt still, too still, like the quiet that lingers in old houses that have seen too much. The kettle clicked softly behind us. I turned to him, searching for something to say that wouldn't sound like a question. But before I could, he spoke again. "You've been alone out here a lot, haven't you?" The question caught me off guard. There wasn't pity in his tone, only a kind of quiet understanding that made it hard to meet his eyes. "I'm used to it," I said. "Silence doesn't scare me anymore." He nodded slowly, looking around the room. The framed photos, the fading wallpaper, the signs of a life paused mid-sentence. "Julia said you've been keeping busy," he murmured. "She worries too much," I replied. He smiled then, small but real. "That's what she does." Something in that moment shifted. Something small but undeniable. Not attraction. Recognition. The kind that happens between two people carrying different versions of the same loneliness. That night, as I stood before the mirror, I wasn't thinking about him, not directly. I was thinking about the way the house felt after he left, how it seemed quieter than before, how the sound of the wind outside suddenly felt like a question I didn't want to answer. The next day, his truck returned. I hadn't called him. Julia hadn't mentioned it either. Yet there he was again, stepping out with that same uncertain calm, a man pretending to have a reason to be somewhere he shouldn't be. This time, I was prepared. Not for him, but for myself. I had made coffee, tidied the kitchen, and told myself it was just another visit. But when he sat at the table, his hands resting around the same mug he'd used yesterday, it didn't feel ordinary at all. We talked. Not about gutters or house repairs, but about life in small, unguarded pieces. About how time changes the sound of a home. About how people can share a life yet feel like strangers in the same room. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "I feel like Julia and I are actors in a story that ended long ago. We just keep saying the lines because it's easier than silence." I wanted to tell him that I understood, that I'd lived that kind of silence for years before my husband left. But I didn't. I only said, "It's strange how love can fade without either person doing anything wrong." He looked at me for a long time after that, his eyes soft, searching. There was nothing improper in that look, only honesty, the kind people rarely allow themselves. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated by the door. I don't know why I keep coming here, he admitted. Maybe you just needed to be somewhere you don't have to pretend, I said. He nodded, almost to himself, and left without another word. I watched his truck disappear down the road until the sound of it faded completely. Then I stood there, staring out into the stillness, realizing that sometimes the most dangerous connections aren't born from desire, but from recognition. And that morning was just the beginning. That afternoon, I told myself I was ready. Calm, composed, in control. A simple dress, hair tied back neatly, shoes that made quiet sounds on the old wooden floor. Nothing about me was careless this time. When Mark arrived, I greeted him with a polite smile, avoiding his eyes. I already knew what those eyes had seen before, and what they hadn't forgotten. Still worried about the gutters? I asked lightly. He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. Actually, thought I'd check your kitchen sink. Julia said the faucet was dripping. We both knew it wasn't, but I opened the door anyway. He sat at the table while I pretended to rearrange things that didn't need rearranging. The bowl of fruit, the vase by the window, anything to keep my hands busy. Yet I could still feel his gaze. Not intrusive, not inappropriate. Just searching. Finally, he spoke. You doing all right? The question was simple, but it landed heavy. I froze before answering. I'm fine. Why? He traced the rim of his mug with his thumb. You just seem quieter lately. I took a seat across from him. That's because I am quieter lately. He smiled faintly, not amused, but as though he understood something unspoken. Yeah, he said softly. Sometimes I walk around the house with Julia and feel like a guest, like we're still married, but somewhere along the way, we stopped arriving home. I shouldn't have leaned forward, but I did. Marriage isn't always a home, I said quietly. Sometimes it's just a hallway with too many locked doors, and that was where it began. We talked for almost 2 hours, not about the sink, not about repairs, but about the kind of heartbreak that doesn't scream. It just fades, quietly, the kind that lives in unspoken sentences and nights spent pretending to sleep. He admitted that Julia hardly looked at him anymore, that he missed being seen. And for the first time, I said something I had never dared to before. I don't miss my husband, I confessed. I miss the person I was when someone loved me. Silence followed, not awkward, but thick, present, alive. Then, as he reached for the sugar, his hand brushed mine. It was nothing, really. A brief, accidental touch. But it felt like the air itself changed. I should have pulled away. I didn't. When my husband left, he didn't just take his belongings. He took the part of me that believed I was worth looking at. The truth is, he stopped seeing me long before he walked out. The house had gone quiet long before the door ever closed. Mark noticed that silence in me. That's what kept bringing him back. Not attraction, but recognition. A shared loneliness. That evening, when he stood at the door ready to leave, he hesitated. I tell you things I don't even tell Julia, he said quietly. Is that wrong? I met his gaze, steady but uncertain. Maybe, I whispered, but it feels honest. He nodded. That's why I keep coming here. When he left, I stayed by the door, staring at the empty driveway, realizing I already knew he'd return, and that I wouldn't stop him. The third time was different. No excuses, no repairs. It was Saturday. Julia had taken the kids to her parents. Mark was supposed to be out golfing, but his truck pulled in like it knew the way. He didn't knock. He just stood there, calm, certain. I opened the door, stepped aside. No words. He entered quietly, as if the silence itself had called him back. He sat on the couch, looking around the room like it was familiar now. Safe, even. Everything about that moment was wrong. And yet, it didn't feel wrong. It felt inevitable. We sat there for what felt like hours, sunlight slowly crawling across the carpet, neither of us daring to speak first. The stillness between us demanded something, a decision, a truth, maybe both. Finally, he said it. "I think about you." His voice almost a whisper. "More than I should." My hands trembled. "Do you think about Julia when you're here?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "I try to." That answer hurt more than any denial could have. We sat shoulder to shoulder, barely touching, yet the air between us felt alive, humming with everything we weren't saying. I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to feel the weight of it, the danger, the ache, the quiet pulse of being seen again. Then came the moment that changed everything. He reached out, not to touch, not to claim, but to ask. His hand hovered in the space between us, waiting. I didn't take it, but I didn't move away either. And sometimes that's all it takes. Not the act itself, but the almost. The moment before the line is crossed. When the heart whispers yes, even while the mind stays silent.